Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Anne Livingston and I'm the Chair of the Queensland Government-funded Community Care Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative. I will be moderator for today's webinar titled Digital Engagement Tools to Enhance Community Wellbeing and Sustainability. Again, this webinar is part of a series of sessions being facilitated by Community Resourcing for the Community Care Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative. Designed from feedback and requests we've received through the collaborative, these webinars are bringing together local, national and international perspectives in research and development. They are specifically designed to focus on the deployment of smart assistive technology across a range of technologies and specifically to concentrate on their application in community care sector. Community resourcing has extensive international linkages and we've been fortunate to work with many international projects and research. You'll see some of these names on the following slide. Again, at today's webinar, we have representation from every state and territory, as well as some international visitors who have come on board today. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the attendees from the UK and our presenter who is presenting from Canada in the evening or this morning our time. Those who have attended previous sessions know that community resourcing has been funded by the Queensland Government to bring together an online platform for community care service providers who are interested in collaborating on issues and practices related to the application of smart assistive technology. Our project has achieved extensive international and national geographical reach, and this is growing daily. We're very pleased to announce that we're over the 1,000 collaborators in this site and moving quickly towards hopefully 2,000 collaborators. As many are aware that we have a number of projects now concentrating on consumer engagement, and one of these is the inclusion of a consumer access filter on the site. We've employed co-design and collaboration concepts in developing this new area, and we look forward to your feedback on this enhancement. Further, we're also actively recruiting individuals and their families to participate in projects in this space. Some of those projects are led by major researchers, some of those projects are being led by technology developers, and some by community care providers. Today's session, it's important to note that neither Community Resourcing or the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services are promoting or endorsing any particular product, research entity or organisation. Rather, our webinars serve to inform viewers of examples of various smart assistive technology in deployment and or in development. It's important to note that as attendees at today's session and in the interests of recording, we've muted your microphones. We encourage you though to ask as many questions as you like, and these questions can be added to the question pane on the dashboard to the right of your screen. There will be an opportunity at the end of the session to have these answered. As at previous sessions, we've been inundated with questions, so post your questions early so we can ensure that we can cover them in today's session. Any questions that we haven't covered, we'll make every attempt to have the presenter cover after the session. Today's session is presented by Dr. John Lewis, and he's going to present on his work on digital engagement tools that are enhancing community wellbeing and sustainability. By way of introduction, Dr. John Lewis is a community planner and a landscape architect with particular research expertise in the areas of urban and landscape design, geodesign and community engagement software, accessible planning and age-friendly communities. He has worked professionally as an urban planner and is currently a planning advisor to a range of cities, towns and areas throughout Canada. He was also one of the main researchers and authors of Finding the Right Fit, an age-friendly community planning from Ontario's Seniors Secretariat, which is a province-wide guideline for evaluating and creating age-friendly communities. Dr. Lewis is a founder and CEO of Vidya Inc., a software startup based in Canada. This software startup advocates for and works with communities to advance the twin ideas of contemporary community planning, visioning and collaborating for sustainable community growth. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Dr. Lewis.
Well, thank you, Anne, and it's a real tremendous pleasure to be able to take this time with all of you that are attending to share the work that we've engaged in over the last few years. And I want to start off the presentation by, more or less telling a bit of a story. And I kind of want to discuss what our company does by at least initially talking about the journey that has brought us to this place. So the first thing I usually get asked when I'm presenting or I talk to somebody about Vidya is, where does that really bizarre name come from? And so Vidya itself has a little bit of a story. I'm a bit of a history buff, and Vidya is actually a Sanskrit word. I've read a number of history books that document the origins of the English and other Indo-European languages. And so in Sanskrit, Vidya refers to knowledge. Also refers to learning. And in English, it's become, I guess, the root word for the terms vision and idea. And that really neatly encapsulates what my company is about. What we try to do when we work with communities is to capture and really give expression to people's ideas and their aspirations for community change. So I'm presenting a couple of quotations from some documents that have been published fairly recently by Deloitte Consulting in Canada. And these quotations underscore the importance of the work that we're undertaking at Vidya. And so this first statement essentially says that the governments in Canada and elsewhere in the world ought to improve their interactions with citizens. And to a large extent, this drive to improve interaction, to improve the exchange of information, is really coming from citizens themselves. And looking at some of the trends that we're observing, as well as other companies in this space, we're finding that, to a large extent, the movement that's afoot to stimulate more interaction between governments and their citizens, as well as between citizens themselves, coming from the millennial generation. These are individuals who are used to working with and interacting with each other through social networks, as well as being able to interact with private companies to not only acquire goods, but also just to exchange information. So this next slide is a statement, or at least something that's come out of the federal government, or recent federal government initiatives here in Canada. Our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, about a year ago, has been advised by senior advisors within his office that perhaps the federal government of Canada ought to be looking to its private sector counterparts to improve the level of service that our federal government delivers, and to be able to engage with our citizens in such a way that we're emulating more or less the way that banks as well as other companies interface with their customers. So there seems to be a message resonating among governments, and we're seeing this at all levels of government within Canada, from the municipal to the provincial as well as the federal level, that it's time to start interfacing with our citizens. Some governments are treating them, or at least thinking them or conceptualizing them as customers. Now here's where the story starts. Okay, I'm showing you a map, and this is the work that I used to do when I was a graduate student in British Columbia. So how this pertains to Vidya, I would sit down with community organizations, First Nations or Aboriginal communities in particular, working with forestry companies to try and convey forest development plans to local residents. So as part of a consultation exercise, we would sit down and we would present mapping information of this sort, and then just ask community groups, if this kind of harvesting activity is occurring within your landscape, What are your reactions? To what extent is it going to compromise your ability to engage in traditional subsistence activities? Invariably, we would get statements that, regardless of whether they were elders or whether they were people who were younger and more adept at reading mapping information, it's probably not the most clear or comprehensible way to present information to a community to try and get across important environmental and land management issues. So it was a no-brainer that we started to present information this way. We would present it in both formats. We would present, the 2D planimetric information that you see above, but then we would also translate it using some software and visualization software into the kind of the 3D realistic landscape form that you see below. When we sat down with communities and presented the information in this manner, the results and the reactions that we would get were palpable. We would not only get immediate recognition of the places that they were looking at, we were also getting some very rich data about how these forest harvesting activities were impacting traditional values as well as recreational assets, etc. We would also get some affective or emotional responses about whether or not they felt that what was being done to their landscape was consistent with what they considered to be their own sense of place. So here we are kind of moving forward into some of the work that I've done more recently. And I've continued to work in the visualization domain for a number of years, communicating landscape plan information, as you would see in the image on the top, or working with local governments to communicate architectural visualizations for local planning processes. So the visualizations that I'm showing you right now, they very substantially address the information clarity issue. A picture does say 1,000 words. People generally have a better understanding of what a development proponent is putting on the table. However, there's always a however, the new challenges that these present generally include, and this was rather surprising in our own work, my previous work as a consultant, the anger that you would sometimes receive or experience from a community that would generally look at images like this and see what they considered to be a fait accompli. In other words, the detailed photorealism suggests that all of the difficult challenges and issues have more or less been resolved, and the decision has in effect already been made. So from a citizen's or a community resident's point of view, there isn't much scope to get into these images and to be able to experiment or redesign what they're being presented with. So here's a more recent example. When a company was approached, this was when video was in its sort of early stages, and a local government came to us and said, we had presented this wonderful AutoCAD drawing to our local council. And what this CAD drawing illustrates is a rapid transit scheme through a downtown core. And what the question that was being asked of the councillors is, there's 9 pedestrian and vehicle armatures that are being proposed for this intersection. To what extent do you think that this kind of development or proposal will intrude upon the aesthetic quality of what the city considers to be a main gateway to their downtown? Almost predictably, the councillors basically said they just really could not make sense of this kind of information. And so we were approached by a local planning department to basically say, can you present this in such a way that it's a bit more clear? So we were able to produce the animation that I'm now showing you on the bottom of the screen. So again, we were able to get, this dynamic visualization pulled together. The councillors were able to see what was being proposed. The information was much more clear and comprehensible. But notwithstanding the fact that it is a dynamic visualization, it is still static in many ways, in large part because what is being presented is limited. In other words, if you're looking at the scenario, if you're looking at this as a planning option, there is no capacity for the user, the perceiver, the viewer, to be able to embed themselves in the scenario and be able to change it to perhaps suit their own needs and expectations. Now, I'm going to recognize the fact that we prepared other scenarios for them. But again, it was still very much limited to what we were able to prepare in advance. So the status quo of visioning or engaging communities to do dialogue really about possible futures is somewhat still limited. And it does really limit the the capacity of cities to be able to build trust. We're finding that communities are failing to reach the potential breadth of ideas that actually exist and that are available to public agencies from their communities. So we founded Vidya on about 4 fairly basic principles, and the first one being collaboration. This is probably a no-brainer. And that is the extent to which engagement is really a dialogue. I mean, I can safely say that I have encountered government agencies throughout Canada that still treat it as a monologic process. In other words, we're imparting information and maybe getting a little bit of feedback, but to the extent that communities are given the opportunity to be able to design, share their own ideas, experiment with ideas, we're not exactly at the point where we're getting exchange, real true exchange happening between government agencies, developers, as well as citizens. Accessibility. We really fundamentally believe that engagement, and I'm not talking about consultation, we're talking about true engagement, ought to be an open process. So whenever I've worked with communities, engagement is often set up in such a way that the local government will set up a time and a place to meet with its citizens. And usually the usual suspects will attend these events. But what we're trying to do with some of the technologies that we're developing is to be able to make engagement and provide the kind of dialogic opportunities accessible and available to all people at all times in any place. So they're not necessarily limited to one venue and at one particular time in their calendars. This one is a little bit interesting, and we really do underscore in our company the notion of creativity. So we do have rivals in the commercial space that, tend to premise what they've developed on the notion of, liking, the thumbs up, thumbs down approach to looking at development scenarios and being able to sort of impart their own preferences that way. But what we really believe at Vidya is that creativity should be tapped. And the software that we're working on, and some of the software that we've actually integrated into some of our flagship products, allows residents to be able to get inside some of the development scenarios and be able to modify and test possible solutions, to be able to look at the visuals as well as be able to test what those development scenarios might do to their landscapes or to their environments. And then finally is this notion of usability. And what we've been very big on, in contrast to some other players in the space, is the notion of building or using gaming theory approaches to development. And so, in other words, we believe that if you're going to use our technologies, they ought to be as simple and as easy to use as somebody who sits down with a video game and wants to play Call of Duty within 30 minutes. So, through user tests and just literally taking our products out onto the street and into workshops and into public fora, people from as young as 8 and to as old as 80 have been able to say that what we've created is probably a very smart and intuitive form of Minecraft, but Minecraft for older or more mature and intelligent people. So here we go. Here's some of the work that we've been able to tap into recently. And this is not what we have created, by the way, but this was something that was presented to us. So in one of our earliest contracts, we were working with the community, or at least the community approached us and said, we need to do a public engagement exercise. And what we're undertaking right now is an age-friendly community plan. And what we want to do is reach out to our residents and be able to tap into their understanding, their knowledge, and their ideas about what works in the community, what helps them to age and age in terms of a high quality of life, what physical or sensory barriers might exist within the community in order to, address accessibility issues, etc. The big idea that they had was, and they took this from another city within the province of Ontario, was to build a physical model. And so what they were going to do with this physical model was take it into workshop settings and gather people around the table, and the people would just place the push pins that you can see in these images. And then there'd be a transcriber, usually a co-op student or a university student, working for the summer, furiously writing down notes about what residents had to say about the good and the bad about their communities. Our take, or at least our message to them was, yeah, that's a really great idea, but we could actually do maybe one better. And so what we did was we converted, or at least we turned their community into a digital environment. And that's wherein we developed one product within our repertoire of software called My Community Vision. So we created a simple three-dimensional representation of this particular town. And then we embedded within it, and this is certainly not new, I mean, we embedded within it the capacity for residents of the community, and this is online, by the way, and it has been used in workshop settings as well, to enter their own address and their names, etc., but also to perhaps remain anonymous if they have some particularly interesting things to say about their community. And then be able to go into the survey and be able to say, okay, in response to questions about outdoor spaces and public buildings, you know, how do you feel about some of the community assets that exist within your town? So rate them according to the scale that you see on the right, as well as, just as they would with the physical model, be able to place push pins and say to the planners in the town, this is where you're doing a really good job, you know, and do more of this throughout the community. But we also give people the chance to flag, you know, areas where there may be accessibility issues, there may be problems that need to be redressed. And so when we did this within workshops, I mean, again, I'm going to come back to the usual refrain that we get from people that we present to, that you are using digital technologies with older adults. Well, yes, we are. And the sense that older adults can't grasp digital media is, as far as I'm concerned, a myth. When I interact with a number of older adults that have iPads or access to iPads, it's difficult to pry them out of their hands. And then secondly, we've tried to also turn this kind of software into a learning opportunity. So we pair up older adults with younger adults and turn it into an intergenerational learning exercise. And that in itself becomes a very high value proposition for the people that we work with. So my community vision has evolved, and we've taken it in the direction of building it in such a way that you can just essentially acquire the product and then roll it out as a two-dimensional map with all the survey and pinpoint capabilities that you saw in the previous release. But we've also built in some additional modeling capabilities where, as in the second image, we have access to open data sources within Ontario that allows us to fairly efficiently, very efficiently in fact, build 3D massing representations of entire communities. And then looking at the bottom right image, some of our clients have actually asked us to go one step further and model or visualize particular buildings and building features at relatively high detail. Why do this? Why go to that nth degree? Well, some of our customers, and I'm talking about public agencies, wish to highlight special project areas, and they need that level of detail in order to impart or at least get across some issues. They also may want to delve into subtler urban design issues that high resolution and high detail can only get at. But then, again, this just comes from working with communities and just kind of testing and just gauging, you know, how receptive they are to these environments. Again, older adults, younger adults, they're essentially looking at this, and they are absolutely intrigued with the ability to be able to see their own place, their community represented in this environment in such a way that they can see where they live, they can see the community assets that they frequent regularly, and it resonates with them on an emotional level. And that really attracts them to using our application and our software. So here's an example of how we've deployed it to address accessibility issues. So communities are essentially putting information out about what is being done to address accessibility in the public domain. So the user goes in, they click one of the pointers, or at least the icons that you see in the middle of the screen, and up pops some information about what's being done. Transportation, they can talk about what needs to be done. In other words, how ought the jurisdiction address other aspects of the community in order to improve its accessibility. And accessibility is an important thing, at least in the province of Ontario, and it should be important in other jurisdictions, but at least here there is a major policy directive, and it's required by law, that all public buildings and public spaces should be fully accessible by the year 2025. So it's a very salient policy issue to most local governments. And then this one slide is one of the true value propositions of the technology to local governments. Just getting analytics and being able to process those analytics in real time has become somewhat of a valuable asset. So built into our software, you have engines which are essentially processing the data as residents input their own ideas and values. the planners look at it, they get a very quick sense of what's being said within their communities. And then they can adapt and they can actually react to some of the information that they're seeing. So as a researcher, I know that, sometimes when you go out there with some preformed hypotheses, that some unexpected findings may ensue, and that it's vital that you go in and start to test and start to ask questions about some of those unexpected findings. And that's what communities largely do with regard to, or at least in terms of these back-end analytics. So that's what I would refer to as sort of the low end of the engagement spectrum. And then on the higher end, the company has been working in this area that we refer to as geodesign. And you can see a couple of images of some of the technologies that we've developed. And the next phase in the evolution of what we consider to be better engagement is to give communities the ability to really ask, in quotes, what if? In other words, we should give the residents of a city, a town, or in a rural context, the ability to change environments in real time, to be able to view those changes, to be able to comment on aesthetic impacts, but also more importantly, to be able to discover the consequences and hopefully have a dialogue about those consequences. So these are capabilities that our colleagues in the Geographic Information System world know as geodesign, and we're partnered with Esri as a business partner. And geodesign really refers to two things. I mean, first, it essentially refers to modeling current environmental conditions. And I'm really watering this, or making this very basic, but looking at and being able to model potential changes. So making real-time adjustments to what's being presented. But it's that second bullet that really is the important one. It's the ability to make those changes and then get metrics about what those changes actually mean. So we can do that in terms of cost or energy efficiency, and we're also working on the development of carbon technologies. So let me just go at what this looks like and why planning authorities are looking at this. So I'm making a gross generalization about how planning really works, but this is a sort of a textbook approach. So we look at how sustainability ought to be addressed, and so a jurisdiction may say, well, there are high-level objectives that are being formulated by policymakers, and then their staff, come out and craft, hopefully in consultation and collaboration with residents, scenarios about how those objectives ought to be addressed. And so those are evaluated for their fit with established policy. And then typically what will happen is that one or maybe a very small subset of the established scenarios or identified scenarios are then selected as preferred and then forwarded on for technical and scientific evaluation. So this is what we would refer to in Ontario as an environmental assessment process. So when that happens, and there's a reason why the line in between is rather long, is that the scenario generally goes out, and the consultant's taken a fairly substantial amount of time to look at it, evaluate it, and then it goes back to the local authority for a revision. And this sort of recursive process keeps going until something is basically selected and approved and implemented. Geodesign is a totally different beast, and so what this is ostensibly trying to do is to shorten the process by more or less taking those 3 or more scenarios that you see in the graphic, and then embedding within a digital space the capacity to model those environments and have metrics within the software that will measure those scenarios and look at how those scenarios perform. And so what we've been doing, and these are sort of research tests that we've been conducted with a technology that we developed, we've been able to see how people are able to look at the scenarios that have been developed and then in real time, after they've had a chance to review the indicators, modify those scenarios until what they're looking at and what they're proposing gets closer to what they consider to be a more sustainable outcome. And then ultimately, we were able to get something which is addressing these four key points. So our geodesign capacity or capabilities, we're trying to get multiple scenarios embedded and evaluated within a single digital application. We're trying to develop capabilities where sustainability metrics are generated as scenarios are created. We don't want to eliminate consultants because honestly you can't do that, but you can reduce the reliance on them to the extent that you're able to use your own sort of internal in-house consulting application to just look at what you're creating and evaluate it for yourself. And this, what we've found, has the net effect of reducing the time and cost required to produce the ideal outcome. So very quickly, I'm going to look at some of the things that we've done. And this first application is called Iris. And again, I'm going to present these as prototypes because these are not completed, and we've been doing a great deal of experimentation in the geodesign world. And it's our ultimate goal to be able to take some of these applications and embed them within our My Community Vision environment. But the first thing that we've tried to do, and we've been asked by local authorities, is how can you take all that open data that pertains to zoning and be able to place it in an environment where local or citizens can sort of go online and say, okay, I want to look at the property, my property or a property that is being subject for redevelopment, and be able to see all the zoning information. So we've been able to sort of mine and scrape that information, from open data sources and embed it within our software. And we've called this the land use editor. But the one key thing that we find that residents often struggle with, and of course, citizens are not planners, they're not civil engineers, is just being able to see for themselves what some of that information actually means. So looking at the property lines, looking at what setbacks mean, and in some cases also being able to see what maximum heights represent, for the parcels that they are interested in looking at. So in this case, a 75-meter high building that would be allowed, within this particular area. As well as looking at various floor area ratio options. We've created what we refer to as the right-of-way editor. And so when we looked at doing streetscape plans with communities, let's just rely on, or at least draw on a little bit of planning theory. The notion of complete streets is becoming quite important, at least within the Canadian context, and I'm sure it is elsewhere in the world. But the ability of communities and residents to look at, rights of way, or roads and streets, arterials, and be able to test out and look at what it means to change lane configurations, to be able to add bike lanes, to expand walkways and pathways along through the urban core, and be able to share their ideas about what a complete street means to them. And so in this particular context, we're getting people online, we're getting them engaged, we're getting them to understand what the notion of complete streets mean, we're getting them to be able to share their ideas about complete streets, and of course embedded within this software we also have some engineering parameters so that the user can't just do whatever they want wherever. This is where things are getting a little interesting because we've been tapping into some larger scale issues on sustainability within the region of Waterloo, and then hopefully we're going to be expanding this scope within Canada. But Iris 2 was developed to address some carbon issues. So we've been modeling carbon to the extent that we have an urban forest modeler which has a carbon sequestration model attached to it. And then we also have some vehicle emissions models that are based on cars, buses, light rapid transit, and active transportation. The dashboard that you see down below, which is a work in progress, is simply a very quick graphic, a very heuristic way of representing the carbon emissions so that users can essentially change those sliders that you're looking at right there, even within categories, so that they can look at cars and different subclasses of vehicles and be able to say, well, what if we got more people out of their cars and into either public transit or into active transportation? What does that mean for the community's carbon footprint? And so we can have a dialogue, we can educate our citizens, and we can have, a meaningful exchange of information and ideas about what needs to be done in order to address some really salient policy issues that deal with global sustainability. So where we're at right now is we've got this company, and we've also got all these tools that are rapidly emerging. And it all really was predicated on this visualization foundation. And for us, and having worked for many years in the planning world where visualizations or the visuals were just really the end product to market and convince citizens of the importance and the need for a particular proposal, it is our premise that visualization and the capabilities that we've given to visualization should be a process that facilitates understanding but it also facilitates the exchange of information, not just between citizens and governments, but also between citizens themselves, just to be able to share ideas and have some type of real learning occur within communities. So that really concludes the discussion at this point, and I'm very willing to entertain questions.
That's a great presentation. I guess your presentation's part of a series of issues and exploration we're having in the collaboration around the use of data and how community care providers can be more engaged in the use of data that they hold, but the use of data that the communities that they live and work in hold. So in terms of your data sets and data input, could you explain where you get your data sources?
That is the usual question that we get from somebody that says, you know, well, it looks like it might be something that would be very expensive to obtain and probably very technically difficult to be able to integrate within our system. And, you know, truth be told, and this is at least within our own particular context in Ontario, this kind of land information data is really becoming more publicly available and publicly accessible. And so we've been able to tap into some of those open data sets, and we've been able to integrate and build some of these three-dimensional models, you know, relatively expeditiously or efficiently. And notwithstanding some of the 3D capabilities, which are, you know, quite attractive to communities to be able to use with their citizens, we also advocate that, you know, if you're content, you know, with working with the community on sort of the two-dimensional level, that some of the applications that we've developed, such as My Community Vision, are amenable to that as well.
Terrific, thank you. We've recently had our state government put in place an Open Data Institute. John, I don't know if you're aware of that, but that's a great opportunity to explore the range of open sources available in this state here as well, and we're certainly going to share your presentation with them. You talked a lot about the engagement of older people, and I've got a question from Glenys around that level of engagement that comes with groups of older adults. And Glenys' comment is that in her program she's struggling to see that level of engagement. Can you comment on, you commented on older people having iPads and then finding it very difficult to remove them from them. Can you comment on your experience of engaging older people and their level of engagement?
Well, it's interesting, and when I can only just impart this in terms of some of the experiences we've had recently, but you know, my fondest recollection was when we deployed My Community Vision for the first time, and of course software always has, you know, some hiccups and there are always issues, but it was a very successful deployment. So when we were working with some of these older adults, and it was a workshop setting of about 75 or 80 people, and they were divided into tables and they were all sitting around the screen. We did have some facilitators that, you know, were helping them work with the tool. But we've also had other occasions, you know, where the residents, you know, just want to essentially immerse themselves in the technology and be able to just sort of, as they put it, you know, give me the driver's wheel so that I can sort of use it and work with it myself. So the only way that I can sort of, you know, convey, you know, what technology and what software like this means to older people is that once you see, again, your community, your place, the place to which you have, you know, really profound emotional, personal attachments, you know, you want to, you know, really immerse yourself in it, and you want to get engaged with the tool that is being presented to you, and that's kind of the experience that we've been getting, you know, from many of our older adults. I've worked with other older adults, you know, who have very little skill or experience working with computers, and as I've said to, or at least I said at the outset of the presentation, you know, where there may not be the kind of capacity in those contexts to be able to use a computer or to use software like this, notwithstanding the fact that we tried to make it as easy as possible. again, we turn that limitation into an opportunity. So we work with the community to be able to set up opportunities, for students of all ages, young adults, middle-aged adults as well, to be able to get together with older residents and to be able to sit down, one, impart, how to use the software, and then even more profoundly, be able to have a really interesting and meaningful exchange of information about what the community means to them.
That's great, John. Thank you. John, I've got questions coming through on our question pane, and just to remind people who are in attendance, the opportunity to post your questions is now. So you can do that on the right of your screen or on the question pane. I've got a question about the future of other technologies, and the question is asking, I'm wondering about the future potential for VR and AR tech there's a lot of abbreviations here, in MCV, whereby members to the community could be in the field seeing augmented examples of future developments and responding to those simulated real-time changes.
Yeah. No, it's certainly an avenue that we had pursued, and again, this is sort of R&D that we've kind of put into the background, but we're going to revisit it and bring it back in. So a few years ago, I was able to get a grant, to obtain some head-mounted displays, and so what we were doing was working with the Iris environment to not just give people an on-screen version of what they were looking at, but if you could bring people into a workshop setting where there's a few Oculus Rift VR headsets available, could you just basically put those on, and could you see the scale, of the development that's being proposed? Because as a landscape designer, I know that when you're looking at a development or a massing model that's being presented to you on a computer screen, it's a far different impression of the full scale of what's being proposed than, if you're able to look at it in situ. In other words, you're standing in the environment and taking it in its full scale. So yes, I mean, there is wonderful opportunity in the future to take some of the tools that we've created, and we're certainly in discussion with communities here in Ontario about taking development proposals, putting them into the My Community Vision space, and then because the software is online, citizens can go and look and see what the development looks like. And then if they want to come into a local authority and there's relatively affordable VR technology available, they can, again, strap it on and have a look and get a real true sense of what the scale of what's being proposed.
Thanks, John. There's many people on today's link who are looking at redevelopment activities for their community services and also their residential and housing developments. And I've just got a couple of comments that have come through on the question pane, more than perhaps questions, but you might like to comment on those. I've got one from Maria who's saying your creative engagement in co-designing, she sees really applicable to her projects upcoming in co-designing, co-creating community services, but also the infrastructure that is going along, and those principles of creative engagement are obviously ones that Maria is going to look closer at.
Wonderful.
And then I've got another comment from Tony that he's very interested in the consumer-led innovation perspective, and certainly from some of the work that Tony's been directly involved in and that we've been involved in through the Community Care Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative, is that we're seeing in some incidents that consumers are leading the charge to innovation and new services, sometimes ahead of service providers. And Tony asks, have you had any of this similar experience, particularly in disability settings?
In disability settings. So I hope I addressed the question comment effectively here. So, and I'm going to, also link back to the previous comment about co-creation. I think that the accessibility piece is one that's actually very important. It's kind of near and dear to my heart. I didn't show this one application that we had created called the Urban Design Editor. And we'd had local authorities asking us whether or not we could develop an environment where if we could model a city or a streetscape, could we give the user, whether it's an in-house designer, planner working for a developer or for a local authority, or could we give citizens the ability to, redesign the street, add street furniture, change lane configurations, etc. But more importantly, to add accessibility features and to test accessibility features within that 3D environment. So that is something that we again had explored, and we were hoping to be able to carry forward fairly quickly. But then the MCV work kind of sidetracked us a little bit. But being able to revisit accessibility, and perhaps even being able to address questions of universal design and how universal design principles can be embedded within urban design, is something that we would actually like to come back to as a company and revisit.
Great. John, I've got some queries from Jeff here and a couple of comments, I guess. Beyond the urban planning and moving into, I guess, the space of policy and planning for new services and the structures in which services are evolving and revolving around in Australia. Jeff was keen, he picked up on your comment that you've been able to move governments from monologue to dialogue and a real exchange and co-creation of new destinations, I guess. Mm-hmm. And he requests or asks if you've got any hints in which he could break through some of the barriers that might be experienced in the Australian policy and planning settings.
It's difficult for me to comment on Australian policy or planning, but the way that we've tried to break through the sort of monologic barrier is again just trying to, or being able to present a space for engagement that is actually truly enticing. So the software, as our users engage it, find that what they're being presented with is not only easy and relatively easy to access and engage, but again, being able to sort of capture that sense of place. And so when users are going on into the My Community Vision platform, it becomes, again, something that resonates with them. It becomes something that they want to be able to participate in. And I don't want to, point fingers at competitors or other applications, but, I can speak in very general terms about how some local authorities are using technologies, and they're still sort of in that very archaic sort of survey mode where we're going to put questions out to our residents, and we'll maybe get some of that information back as Likert scale responses or, open-ended comments. But again, we're not really in a space, or at least those applications are not really in a space where you're giving the opportunity to be able to comment and be able to convey your opinion, and at the same time be able to express your own ideas about what ought to happen. What isn't the local authority considering? What should the more salient or more pressing social and policy issues become and be? So that's wherein, our direction, our development direction, has taken on that more dialogic approach.
Thanks, John. I've just got one final question in the time that we've got available today. This is from Emmy. Emmy's, I guess it's a more broader general question, probably a good one to end with, John. Emmy's asking, in the era of big change, do you have some strategies in which to keep up? Emmy's a regular contributor to the collaborative
Right.
and finds that useful, but just the emerging data, but also the technologies sometimes is overwhelming when you're not a technologist or a regular user of data. Any strategies that you could give Emmy to keep up with the pace of change and the era of big change?
Oh my gosh. Well, we're having, our own, struggles with dealing with the rapid pace of change, particularly in this space. I mean, there are quite a few players within the engagement environment that have emerged, in the last few years that have, what they consider to be the latest and the best solution. One thing that we have dealt with and at least addressed in terms of the availability of data, and there's an organization based in Ontario called the Open Data Exchange, is just trying to be able to get repositories for this information centralized or at least linked in such a way that is efficient for people who are trying to do work and trying to address sustainability issues, make it efficient for them and easy for them to be able to get at what they need. So the one complaint that I've often made to the Ontario government, which they are beginning to address, but pace of government tends to be rather slow, is this whole notion of one-stop shop for open data. And so historically in Ontario, at least within the planning realm, we've had Land Information Ontario for quite some time. And then in other sectors, in the health sector, the finance sector, etc., we're finding that there are other open data repositories opening there too. And so centralizing and linking seems to be the larger problem, and also standardizing how that data is disseminated and communicated. So being able to provide precise and fairly clear metadata standards so that whoever's using it on the outside is able to understand what it is that they're getting.
Yeah. Very important considerations. Thank you, John. That's all that we've got time for in terms of questions. If anyone's got any further questions, you can keep this dialogue happening through the Community Care Collaborative. I'd encourage people, if you haven't already formally registered for the collaborative, that you go online today at www.satcommunity.com.au and register. It's free to register, and you have free access to the resources, including today's presentation, which will be posted up for anyone to access after the end of this session. I'd just like, before finishing our session today and thanking our presenter, just remind people of our upcoming webinars. We've got a number of webinars coming up through April, and you'll see those on your screen now. We've got one on independent living in the age of digital disruption coming up on the 3rd of April. On the 18th of April, smart assistive technology embracing mental health for younger people, presented by Professor Amanda Third from the University of Western Sydney. And on the 26th of April, we've got a special event in conjunction with the National Disability Insurance Agency, where Dr. Lloyd Walker will be talking about the Smart Assistive Technology Agenda and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That's probably one you don't want to miss with the current funding and policy changes that are occurring. I'd also like to remind people that on the 5th of June in Brisbane, we're co-hosting the Australian Living Lab Symposium that will be held at QUT in conjunction with a conference that we're bringing together with numerous collaborators from our community care collaboration, looking specifically at community care business transformation and opportunities for innovation. We've got a range of national and international speakers coming along to that event, and you can get more information on that on our website. I'd particularly like to take the time to acknowledge our presenter today, Dr. John Lewis. John, it's great that you were able to join us this evening, your time, and to present on what is quite a unique aspect and maybe a new and emerging one, but of real interest to our collaborators who are looking at designing, planning, and the policy settings of the future, where data and open data sources are really going to drive some of the opportunities to do things much better, much more creative, and much more engaged with consumers. Thanks very much, John, for your involvement in today's session. Really appreciate your time to do that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Community Care Smart Assistive Technology project team who have brought together today's session and behind the scenes have done extensive work to assist in the technical and the construction of these webinars. Many of you know our project is backed by an expert reference group, and that expert reference group gives their time very freely and gives considerable time to looking at developments within our collaboration. I'd also like to formally thank the Queensland Government for their insight to provide funding for this activity, and also to acknowledge that the government has also seen that although they're leading this collaborative, that it is an issue that we have to collaborate nationally and internationally on, and so we thank them for their vision and support of this project. If you'd like any further information on today's session or any future upcoming sessions or conferences and events, please contact the Smart Assistive Technology project team directly, and you can email them at sat@communityresourcing.com.au. Thanks everyone for your participation today and for listening to today's webinar.